Hey, I'm Dan. Have you ever been so inspired by something someone did that you want to do that exact same thing yourself? When I was a kid, my dad was really good at painting and drawing. And I spent so much time practicing drawing because I wanted to be just as good as he was. Now, Jesus is the ultimate role model. When he came to earth, he showed us how to live. And that can inspire you and me to live more like Jesus. Let's see what we can learn from today's 8-Bit Bible episode. And keep in mind, today's big idea is that Jesus came to show us God's love and save us from sin.
Today, our story is about a naughty nation, a very compassionate God, and the death of an innocent man.
Sin had messed everything up, but God was working on a plan to rescue all of humanity. He had started by promising Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that their families would become a great nation. He then gave the Israelites lots of rules to help them live the best way possible, and he led them to a special promised land so they would be separated from the people around them. But even though God had done so much to take care of the Israelites, they still wanted to live their own way, and they wanted a king. This made God sad, because he wanted the Israelites to trust him as their leader. But he gave them a king anyway. That king wasn't a very good king, but the next king was a great king. King David loved God and tried hard to follow all of the laws and rules that God had given the Israelites. But even he messed up. Then came King Solomon. He was really wise and built a magnificent temple for God. After him, there was a long list of kings who ruled Israel. Some were good, most of them weren't. So God sent prophets to the kings to remind them of how God wanted them to live. But the kings ignored the prophets and still did whatever they wanted to. Eventually, God allowed other nations to take the Israelites away from their homes. But he still loved them and wanted to give them a second chance. So after many years, he allowed them to return to the promised land he had given them. Fast forward a few hundred years, and Jesus was born. You know the story. Mary, Joseph, donkey, manger. And Jesus was God's son, but he was also fully man. Jesus grew up, and when he was 30 years old, he began teaching and talking about God's kingdom. As he taught, he invited 12 guys to travel with him and learn from him. But his teaching made the religious leaders angry because he claimed to be the Son of God and said he was more important than the rules God had given them. So they made a plan to kill Jesus, and eventually they did. But after 3 days, Jesus rose from the dead, and that changed everything. But we can talk more about that next time.
Hi, I'm Patrick, and my parents are just the greatest. I love them. Hey, I'm Patrick, and my parents do not understand technology. I cannot teach them how to use their TVs, their computers, or their iPads for the life of me. I've tried texting them, I've tried writing down instructions, and it just doesn't work unless I'm there in person and I can show them what to do. And then they just seem to get it, which just kind of goes to show you that people learn a lot better when they have someone in front of them telling them what to do. And that reminds me of today's big idea. Jesus came to show us God's love and save us from sin. Previously, we had talked about how God had created everything to be good and perfect, but then sin came and kind of messed everything up. But God didn't leave it that way. God actually had a plan to fix it. He had started by promising Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that their family would one day become a great nation, and it did. He then gave the Israelites laws to help guide them, and also symbols to help point towards Jesus. And then he led the Israelites to the promised land, where they would be set apart from the people around them. And even though God had done so much to get the Israelites to this point, throughout all that time, they still wanted to do their own thing, and they wanted a king, so God gave them a king. Now that first king didn't really turn out to be that great of a king. But the second one was a lot better. That second king was King David. And King David is described in the Bible as being a man after God's own heart. But even he was messed up by sin. After King David came King Solomon. And King Solomon was very wise. And he even built a magnificent temple for God. Now, the temple was kind of intended to be sort of a house for God. But really, the purpose of the temple was to point towards Jesus. Now, I will spare you the time of listing all of the kings, but there were a lot of them after Solomon. Some of them were good, but most of them were pretty bad. God sent prophets to these kings to remind them how to live. It was their job to communicate on behalf of God how others were supposed to live. That's pretty scary, but people still did not listen to them at all. Eventually, God just allowed other nations to take the Israelites away from their homes, but he still really loved them, and he wanted to give them a second chance, so he allowed them to return to the promised land many years later. They still struggled to live God's way. They clearly couldn't do this on their own. They needed to be shown by somebody how to live. They needed to be showed God's love in very real ways. They needed to be reconciled to God. They needed a rescuer. And then fast forward a bunch of years, and Jesus was born. Now, it's kind of crazy, but there were over 350 prophecies that specifically pointed to Jesus' birth. After all that, they still didn't recognize that he was the one that they had been waiting for all this time. Now, Jesus was kind of a paradox. He was fully God's son, but he was also fully human. But his understanding and connection to God was so much greater than anyone else's. In fact, it was greater than anyone else who ever lived. Now, it wasn't until he was about 30 years old that he actually began his ministry, which was teaching and talking about God's kingdom. He invited 12 guys, which were his disciples, to come and learn from him as he did this. They loved and they served people, and Jesus performed miracles. He healed the sick, he made the blind see, and he made the deaf hear. This really caught people's attention. He was showing people God's love in ways that they had never experienced before. But these teachings actually started to make the religious leaders really angry, because Jesus was saying that he was more important than all the rules that they had been following. At one point, the religious leaders actually tried to trick Jesus, and they asked him, "What is the most important commandment that God has given us?" And this is how Jesus responded. He replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." The religious leaders didn't really get this answer. They didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. In fact, they loved the law more than they loved God's own heart. So things escalated a little bit quickly, and they planned on killing Jesus. And eventually, they did kill him, but that wasn't the end of the story. After 3 days, Jesus rose from the dead. This proved that Jesus was who he said he was, God's son, saving us from sin, and that God's love was so big that he was willing to die for us. Jesus' death and resurrection reconnects us with God, and that changes everything. That's all for this week. See you next time.
We learned that God's people wanted kings to rule over them and tell them what to do. So God eventually gave them kings. Some of them were good, some of them were bad, and some of them didn't even listen to the prophets God had sent to guide them. It was only when Jesus came that people could see exactly how to live. But the religious leaders didn't get it, and they wanted to kill Jesus. Let's check in with Jacob and Natalie again to see why Jesus came to earth and why he died.
Hello everyone, it's good to be back. I heard you have more questions. What are you curious about tonight?
Why did Jesus come to earth?
Well, Jesus is God, and so Jesus came to earth to show us how much God loves us, to show us what God is like. It's like today, you guys were canoeing, and I think maybe some of you tipped in the canoe. I won't look at anybody in particular, but if that leader hadn't also been in a canoe as well and paddled over to you and kind of showed you how to get back in and get you upright again, it probably would have been pretty difficult for you to actually get back into the boat and canoe away again. Jesus is God coming to earth to show us how to actually get back into our canoes when we tip over. He shows us how to live and love and serve. Are there any other questions?
Why did Jesus have to die?
Well, Jesus' death is really the climax of history, so there's lots going on. On one level, Jesus was a person living in a country, and the religious leaders of that day got really jealous of him, and they killed him out of jealousy. But we know that there's a spiritual, a kind of cosmic level going on too, that Jesus' death was taking on all our sin, all our pain, all our lostness, and when he died, he took that all away. And we don't know all exactly how that works, but we know that it saved us.
What makes Jesus different from any of the other religious leaders?
Okay, I know that this is gonna come as a surprise to so many of you, but Jesus didn't stay dead. It's actually so cool. What makes him different? Well, every other religious leader ever in history, they died and they stayed dead. Jesus died and then he actually came back to life. We have this big word that we use for it. We say Jesus resurrected from the dead. It just means that he came back to life. And quite frankly, that was his way of showing us, I really am who I say I am. So that's what makes Jesus different.
That means we can still have a relationship with Jesus today because he's still with us. Great questions. Thanks for being here tonight.
Jesus came to show us how to live and love. He didn't just tell us what to do, he literally set the example for us. And as Jacob said, Jesus took all of our sin on him. And that means we can look forward to a life with God forever. Now, let's break into our small groups and see what this looks like in our own lives.